So I've gone and done it again. After last week's huge video, I thought that I would tackle something that was a little easier, simpler, and hopefully would make for a shorter video. But no, obsession has taken over, and once again I've produced a monster. Today we're taking a look at mental health treatment, and how capitalism affects mental health. I've tried to use a lot of research and cite frequently throughout the video. This topic is one which is controversial and highly debated. As per my last video, I've linked a Google Sheet in the video description, which includes the entire script plus all citations. This video includes discussion of depression, anxiety, and mentions suicide. If any of these topics are triggers for you, then please skip this video. As I edited this video, I noticed in a couple of instances I did use mildly derogatory terms for mental health conditions. I intended this as self-depreciating, and it was not intended in any way to be offensive. If, however, you were offended by my use of these terms, please consider this to be my preemptive apology. Now, in the interest of keeping an already long video from getting even longer, let's dive right in. I've always struggled with my mental health. Alcohol abuse, depression, toxic shame, but by far the most chronic is my anxiety. In the 15 years that I've really focused on recovery, anxiety has become my biggest opponent and my constant companion. When it peaks, I descend into complete crippling withdrawal from the world, and in the good times, I feel it, storing energy for another assault, hiding in the periphery, yet so constantly there. I now accept that my anxiety is bred in the bone, to steal a phrase from one of my favorite books. It is simply a reality central to me and my character. Yet there is also too many instances when I can see a direct line between my anxiety and the situation. I know what some of my triggers are, and I know I feel better when I can avoid them. This knowledge always creates a suspicion in my mind that while my anxiety is just mine, just a product of my personality, my upbringing, and my genetic heritage, I also strongly suspect that a purely physiological or trauma explanation aren't sufficient. Environment, the world I live in, seem to me to contribute strongly. So I spent a few hours doing research and discovered that the evidence is pretty clear. I'm not alone, not even close. A 2017 article in Scientific American reports that mental health in the US is appearing to decline in the past 20 years, with suicide rates per 100,000 reaching a 30-year high. Substance abuse is epidemic. Disability awards for mental disorders have dramatically increased. A quote from the magazine Monthly Review in 2021 reports, quote, "A mental health crisis is sweeping the globe. Recent estimates by the World Health Organization suggest that more than 300 million people suffer from depression worldwide. Furthermore, 23 million are said to experience symptoms of schizophrenia, while approximately 800,000 individuals commit suicide each year," close quote. Clearly, the world seems to have a problem that needs to be addressed. Is this a new problem? Most people would say no. As long as there's been people wandering around, there's been at least some crazy. But statistics are pointing to growth, that the number of people suffering from debilitating and painful mental conditions of all types seems to be on the increase. However, this trend is not interpreted consistently. There is a definite and dramatic increase in the number and percentage of people seeking treatment and the number of diagnosed cases of mental illness, but this may be driven by the awareness of mental health and the willingness to seek treatment. To illustrate this, Consider the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association and used as a standard guide to diagnosing mental disorders. The manual was first published in 1952, had 130 pages, and listed 106 mental disorders. The most recent version, DSM-5, has 947 pages and 157 disorders. So theoretically, there are more possible disorders you could be diagnosed with and a lot more knowledge about disorders. Psychiatrists are better equipped to diagnose. So you have to conclude that while mental health is a huge problem, it is unclear if it's getting worse. My own experience would tend to agree. I can look back at my family and see that there were more than a few nuts in the bush. Family history includes suicide, addiction, anxiety, and depression. And we've a tendency to secrecy, so there was probably more than I know. My family hasn't gotten better, but could best be described as reproducing similar results. We also don't seem to be getting any worse. My family history is quite relevant during my trips to various psychiatrists, who found reasons to prescribe me a cocktail of psychoactive medications. This is the biomechanical view of mental health at work. This view has been the dominant approach to science, policy, and practice for more than 3 decades. According to an article published in Clinical Psychology Review, author Brett Deakin writes, quote, "During this time, the use of psychiatric medications has sharply increased, and mental disorders have become commonly regarded as brain diseases caused by chemical imbalances that are corrected with disease-specific drugs." Close quote. As a result, my environment, my career, my personal relationships, my level of education, income, and class are all less relevant to my mental health diagnosis than the relative ratios of chemicals spurting around in my skull and my genetic heritage that, as I've said, tends to produce offspring just one sandwich short of a full picnic basket. So I have a laundry list of diagnoses. I'm completely spun and have qualified for ADD. I'm afraid of most everything and a few things that don't even exist. So I get a nice and broad, generalized anxiety disorder stamp. Of course, I've spent hours staring at my belly button, so I've received a depression disorder qualification. Each one of these medical conditions comes with a preferred prescription filled monthly and taken religiously for about 15 years. I should also add that I have forgotten what happened on many a Friday or Saturday evening in my teens, 20s, and 30s, so I'm also a fully certified alcoholic. But that is the only diagnosis where the recommendation involves not swallowing something psychoactive. I've had it treated in a more traditional community support group way. So, to wrap up, I've got a bunch of diagnoses, and for 15 years, I've been, on a daily basis, swallowing a handful of pills while also avoiding swallowing any intoxicating liquids. I have to say that each of these treatments have, to some extent, helped me live a more comfortable life. I find it easier to concentrate. I'm less debilitated by sadness. At least I don't think about killing myself every day anymore. I also am mostly capable of logical thought, even on weekends. I've not thrown up on anyone in a long, long time. Anxiety, on the other hand, well, I guess I manage it a little more effectively. Nonetheless, you won't hear me complaining about my diagnoses or what the medical profession has done for me. Medication has been helpful. But my experience seems to confirm that psychiatric drugs don't cure the illness. They mask symptoms. You end up using the drugs, often forever, and at great expense. The research supporting this view is pretty convincing. The use of medication to treat mental health has grown by leaps and bounds, and it is clear that mental illness is not reducing its incidence or consistently its severity. More and more healthcare experts are beginning to question the focus on biomechanical view of mental health. Returning to the same article from Clinical Psychology Review, our author, Mr. Deakin, writes, Quote, despite widespread faith in the potential of neuroscience to revolutionize mental health practice, the biomedical model era has been characterized by a broad lack of clinical innovation and poor mental health outcomes, close quote. This has led to a situation where there have been very few innovative new drug treatments for mental health in the past 20 years. There have been new drugs, more selective and fewer side effects, but not necessarily more effective. A Scientific American article reports, quote, finding novel treatments for mental health has become so discouraging that several pharmaceutical companies have shut down or reduced neuroscience research, close quote. This situation is worsened by the fact that pharmaceutical companies have driven a lot of research, while alternative treatments are not supported by as much funding or supported by as much research. Despite the limitations with pharmaceutical treatment, it is often implemented first and exclusively. In an article published in Research in Psychotherapy, Paulo Migone writes, quote, nevertheless, medication is the most common treatment for these disorders. Psychiatrists, in general, prescribe only drugs and disregard the possibility of suggesting psychotherapy to patients suffering from anxiety or depression. Since evidence-based research is ignored, this can be considered a form of malpractice, and it would be unacceptable in the treatment of medical conditions, close quote. Recapping a book by Marcia Angel, a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, the same article goes on to explore why this unfortunate situation has come about. Big Pharma. Big Pharma directly or indirectly supports every medical journal and meeting. Big Pharma finances most, if not all, randomized controlled trials and finances many other types of research. Big Pharma advertises and promotes their products. As a result, Big Pharma influences, perhaps controls, what science doctors are seeing. They underwrite a big portion of the research being done, selecting for practices more likely to generate a profit, and they promote their products, resulting in influencing professionals and patients' opinion. This influence makes it more difficult for doctors to advise patients on non-drug treatments. The pharmaceutical focus is more profitable and more supported. Perhaps I've been lucky. I've had doctors and psychiatrists recommend therapy to me as a support to the medication. Not consistently, but in several instances. I don't consider therapy to be a miracle, but I have to admit, therapy has brought me some really surprising and positive results. The biggest relief I've gotten from the itty-bitty shitty committee that meets regularly in my head has come from these non-pharmaceutical approaches. These interventions have also required a tremendous amount of effort on my part and on the part of people supporting me, whether professional or lay people. Drying out from alcohol revolutionized my life, not because it gave me relief from my essential nuttiness, but because I was consistently lucid enough to stop adding extra destruction to my life. That recovery was with the help of a group of other mostly sober alcoholics for whom working with others is a critical part of their recovery. If you'd like to know more about the group I'm referring to, you'll find them near the top of any alphabetized list of 12-step programs. 15 years later, I don't really miss alcohol at all. It has ceased to be a part of my life whatsoever. Working on my other character flaws, the depression, anxiety, constant agitation, and pretty low self-opinion, has absorbed almost 7 years of regular appointments with therapists. It has been slow and sometimes frustrating process, but I found it to be also profound. There is no sort of complete separation from your painful quirks. Unlike abstinence from alcohol, therapy doesn't offer miracles, but somehow my entire outlook and understanding of my life has become different and easier to live with. This experience leads me to believe that the non-pharmaceutical approaches and a more holistic view of mental illness is different from a view dominated by the biological sciences. These processes give the patient back their sense of autonomy and self-efficacy. The pharmaceutical approach involves describing the issue to the medical professional, supported by some sort of examination as appropriate. The doctor then forms a diagnosis based on the information gathered and lays out a treatment plan. In many ways, this process isn't that much different than any regular physical doctor's visit, or, for that matter, even that different from taking your car to a mechanic. Your responsibility is to be truthful, to pay your bills, and to consume the treatments as per your doctor's advice. You are involved in the purchase of professional services, but your participation in the recovery is minimal. Therapy and support groups, on the other hand, require a patient to be a full participant in treatment. In fact, responsible for directing the course of treatment, the speed, the duration, and the intensity. In the first type of treatment, you are a passive consumer, and in the second, you are an active agent of your own healing. Research backs up the efficacy of therapy. In a resolution published in 2012, based on the data from 50 peer-reviewed studies in psychotherapy, the American Psychotherapy Association said that psychotherapy treatment is safe, effective, and has long-lasting benefits. Published positives include effective in behavioral and mental conditions across the spectrum of populations, teaches patients life skills that last beyond the course of treatment, reduces disability, morbidity, and mortality. And while medication is appropriate in many instances, most treatments also benefit from being combined with therapy. Therapy has opened a door in my mind, and I can begin to unpack, understand, and modify the thought patterns that cause me so much difficulty. I'm not anti-medication. It has given me immediate and necessary relief, but it has never given me a sense of power and hope like therapy. What is particularly surprising about therapy is its effectiveness despite focusing on subjective experience in ways that seem emotional and non-logical versus the science-heavy approaches in pharmaceutical treatment. Whereas pharmaceutical interventions focus on a person as a discrete biological entity, a fleshy machine, if you will, therapy investigates how someone experiences the world. Drugs treat irrespective of situation and environment. Therapy specifically addresses these. Drugs are developed to treat based on reductive biochemical and gene-based views of humanity, and therapy is more inclusive of how that human interacts with their environment. Whereas drugs treat a maladjusted brain as a thing, therapy focuses on a person and treats through a human-to-human relationship. It is less than surprising that therapy is often a successful treatment, and psychiatric drugs are less successful when given as the sole response to mental illness. We have long known that our environment and our relationships have a dramatic impact on our health, both mental and physical. So a treatment that is done in relationship, over time, and specifically brings in our experiences with our environment does seem more focused on the causes of mental distress. Therapy has simply released me from the delusion that I've somehow caused myself to suffer or that I am inherently defective. I've certainly played a role in my suffering, but my reactions and habits were not developed in isolation. It has helped me to understand that my specific tendencies are individual personality traits, and the outcomes, the illness, did not occur spontaneously. At the same time, psychotherapy also suffers from some of the same reductionist issues as pharmaceutical treatment. Therapy deals with individuals and how they manage their environment. It is specifically focused on helping the individual to manage their reactions to their environment and function in that environment. Primarily, therapy takes the environment, whether it's the city, the society, the economy, or the culture that a person lives in, as a given. Therapy helps humans to make the most of whatever they have access to, but ultimately is focused on the individual changing, not changing external forces that the human is subject to. This makes sense, as neither the therapist nor the individual may have the power to change larger circumstances. But it also leaves the individual awash in an ocean of forces in which they are powerless. Most people, when hearing this argument, are going to respond, yes, of course, this is simply being practical. Why should a therapist or an individual focus on forces that they cannot change? Why waste the time and energy, after all? Everyone has to face reality. I would contend that as long as mental health treatments constrain themselves to the individual, whether the individual biochemical conditions or the individual's experience of the world, these treatments will always remain only partially effective. Let's consider a mental condition as an example. PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition caused by a human's response to trauma. It is a disorder that is difficult to treat, but its effects can often be at least partially relieved by therapy, possibly also assisted by medication. But are those treatments going to be particularly effective if the individual with PTSD is continually returning to the traumatic situation? Most likely it'll help, but most likely the symptoms and suffering will continue until the trauma is also ended. It seems highly unlikely that anyone could be totally free from trauma reactions while repeatedly facing traumatic events. In the case of most mental health disorders, is it not possible that we find ourselves in exactly the same type of scenario? In a 2019 Monthly Review article, David Matthews writes, quote, "The intimate relationship between mental health and social conditions has largely been obscured, with societal causes interpreted within a biomedical framework and shrouded with scientific terminology. Diagnoses frequently begin and end with the individual identifying bioessentialist causes at the expense of examining social factors. However, the social, political, and economic organization of society must be recognized as a significant contributor to people's mental health, with certain social structures being more advantageous to the emergence of mental well-being than others." Close quote. This criticism is that psychiatric and therapeutic approaches are narrow and ignore our lives, our societies, and our economic systems. The fact that a huge percentage of the population are affected by mental disorders, and that percentage is consistent, if not growing, suggests that the current treatments are effective because not all root causes are being addressed. So, how might our society be contributing to a degradation in our mental health? After spending a few days doing some basic research, I managed to draw up a long and disturbing list of potential causes. Degrading nature of modern work, constant insecurity, overwork and stress, with productivity linked to self-worth, materialism, alienation and loneliness, repression of creativity and individuality, success and failure all being attributed to individuals' abilities and choices, branding of the self, worsening income distribution and poverty traps, and finally, commodification of mental health services. Degrading nature of modern work. The alienation of a worker from production and the products of their labor diminishes their sense of self-efficacy and leads to a sense of powerlessness. In addition, being subjected to bureaucracy, mechanization, depersonalization, and an oppressive regime also contribute to feelings of oppression and degradation. Essentially, many of us spend our days working on repetitive work, a small part of a larger process, under conditions that are rigid and impersonal, while also often unpleasant, while at the same time having no discernible impact on the final product. We do things that simply aren't rewarding under conditions we don't choose and have to show up day after day to unchanging situations. Because of the combination of unpleasantness and the lack of satisfaction from the work itself, degradation in work increases the risk of developing mental health issues. Constant insecurity. There is ample evidence that advanced capitalism has resulted in increasing insecurity as job security has decreased, while privatization and reduction in social programs has made access to necessities like food, housing, and clothing less assured should a family find itself without a steady income. This insecurity, coupled with powerlessness, creates a sense of being profoundly insecure. One is not protected against purely random circumstance. This can lead to feelings of inadequacy, damage the benefits and structure of family, and is closely linked to many health issues. Overwork and stress. Jimmy Woo writes, quote, "Since the market is, we are told, a level playing field, with no single actor appearing as the obvious coordinator, those who happen to be losers in this global scramble ostensibly have no one to blame but themselves. In such a world, it is extremely dangerous to fall below average, to be deemed inadequate, too lazy or incapable of pulling one's weight, dependent on government handouts, and ultimately a burden on society." Close quote. Given the fear of being proven a loser, we react with fear and competitively try to work more than is required in order to prove our worth. Idleness has become associated with uselessness. We only feel valuable when busy, and we stop being a human being and become a human doing. So we are insecure and overworked. These two stressors tend to degrade both our physical and mental health. The growth in anxiety is one of the most reported mental illnesses in developed countries. Materialism. Materialism is heavily promoted in capitalist societies through cultural norms, economic education, and at incredible levels of repetition through advertising. Materialism is closely associated with mental health conditions. Quote, "Materialism is associated with lower levels of well-being, less pro-social interpersonal behavior, more ecologically destructive behavior, and worse academic outcomes. It also is associated with more spending problems and debt. We found that the more highly people endorse materialistic values, the more they experience unpleasant emotions, depression and anxiety, the more they reported physical health problems, such as stomach aches and headaches, and the less they experienced pleasant emotions and felt satisfied with their lives." Close quote. Materialism tends to drive competitiveness, selfishness, and image over substance. It creates a drive of continual acquisition, while the selfishness tends to increase isolation and loneliness. James Roberts of Baylor University's Hankomer School of Business says, "The fact that we are able to adapt well to new situations may explain why material possessions do not equal happiness." Quote, "As we amass more and more possessions, we don't get any happier. We simply raise our reference point." Close quote. Adding, quote, "The new 2,500 square foot house becomes the baseline for your desires for an even bigger house. It's called the treadmill of consumption. We continue to purchase more and more stuff, but we don't get any closer to happiness. We simply speed up the treadmill." Close quote. Research data confirms people who are more materialistic are more likely to be rated low on gratitude, high on needs, and less satisfied with life, effectively putting themselves at high risk of mental distress. Alienation and loneliness. Meaningful relationships aren't an option but a necessity for human beings. We're social beings who depend on companionship as part of mental and physical well-being. Unfortunately, the values and dynamics of capitalism separate us. In another quote from Jimmy Woo's article, he says, quote, "Indeed, research done by social psychologists such as Tim Kasser have found that individuals who internalize the materialistic ethos of corporate culture exhibit more antisocial activities and lower empathy. In short, the capitalist wage relation alienates us from our product, while the superstructure of labor market alienates us from one another. Close quote. Of course, this isolation comes out of both the structures we serve and the values that underlie them. We work longer, we travel more, our professions ask us to be flexible and to follow wherever our career may take us. We never switch off and are at the constant beck and call of our communications tools. These all cause us to be unavailable for true emotional intimacy, as we have neither the bandwidth nor the energy to give it the focus it requires. We aren't rooted enough, or with enough free time to develop extensive friendships, or stay as close to our families as previous generations did. Barron and Sweezy, in their book Monopoly Capital, comment that a sense of frivolity and superficiality has taken over communication in capitalistic societies, that our social interactions have become dominated by acquaintances and small talk. A report from the Harvard Graduate School of Education shows that 61% of young adults report being lonely all or most of the time. Paradoxically, our technology and social media, their extensive use, designed with connection in mind, have exacerbated rather than helped our loneliness problem. Repression of creativity and individuality. One of the big selling features of capitalism, at least according to the neoliberals, is its purported support for freedom, choice, and individuality. However, the facts to support these claims are very superficial. We have the freedom to choose between many products and can choose products that we prefer. However, to actually engage in creative work that is self-directed or to choose to live in a nonconformist way are highly suppressed by the system. Eric Fromm, in his book The Sane Society, points out how capitalism is relentless in funneling people into wage labor that doesn't satisfy the need to express creativity, rather often represses it through the monotonous, grueling obligations. Of course, I've spoken at length in episode 2 of this channel how rather than supporting individuality, capitalism requires us to work. And more often than not, one of the key requirements of finding a job is to fit in with the business culture of your company. Effectively, you have two choices: conform and work, or endure poverty and fully pursue your individuality. Obviously, capitalism isn't the only human system to enforce social conformity, but to claim that it's somehow free is pure fantasy. Capitalism does stand out in how completely it subsumes normal human desires into damaging parodies. Through the relentless proselytizing of consumerism and brand marketing, humans have been conditioned to try and express their individuality through the products they buy. Quote, "The desire to engage in popular culture and purchase a type of automobile, brand of clothing, or technological equipment, among other goods, is frequently based on what the product is supposed to convey about the consumer. Frequently, consumerism constitutes the principal method through which individuals can construct personal identity. People are emotionally invested in the meanings associated with consumer goods, in the hope that whatever intangible qualities items are said to possess will be passed on to them through ownership." Close quote. But rather than achieving the goal of personal identity, this conspicuous consumption ultimately ends up in meaninglessness. Quote, "Rarely is satisfaction truly achieved through consumption, because what is being consumed is an artificial idea rather than a product that imbues our existence with meaning. In this process, consumerism as a form of alienation becomes evident. Instead of consuming a product designed to satisfy inherent needs, consumer goods exemplify their synthetic nature via manufactured meanings and symbolism, which are designed to stimulate and satisfy a pre-planned response and need. Any identity a person may desire or feel they have obtained from consuming a product, as well as any form of creativity invoked by a consumer good or item of popular culture, is false." Close quote. Success and failure, all attributed to individuals' abilities and choices. There is a constant defense that gets thrown up whenever someone criticizes the inequality that results from capitalism. They argue that capitalism is the great level playing field, allowing those who are hardworking, smart, and risk-taking to benefit greatly, while those who are lazy, untalented, and fearful end up naturally poor and at best middle class. It isn't a good or bad thing. Rather, it is a natural occurrence and should be accepted as a true reflection of nature, kind of like economic natural selection. But if you step back and take even a cursory glance at the multi-generational aspect of poverty, the fact that someone born in poverty tends to remain in poverty, you immediately have to find this argument dubious. In order to accept the argument, you would need to also believe that people who are poor are inferior. This argument is already prejudiced and untrue, but becomes even more deeply immoral when you discover that poverty is often more prevalent among ethnic, sexual, and religious minorities. To accept then the argument is true, you need to be comfortable with holding racist, homophobic, and religiously intolerant views. The unfair nature of inequality and capitalism is reinforced by the ubiquity of materialism as the primary value system. Materialism is an extrinsic and external value, and as such, it encourages individuals to compare themselves against others. This constant comparison, combined with massive and growing inequality, is the perfect set of conditions to grow a society where many individuals are increasingly unsatisfied by their relative ability to demonstrate their value through having sufficiently aspirational possessions. Measurement inevitably brings up a long list of people who are, or appear to be, more materially successful than yourself. So aside from envy and other bad feelings generated, capitalism then gives you answers for how you came to experience this state of affairs. You don't measure up because you have failed in your personality traits or in your decisions. Capitalism strips you down, ruthlessly compares you against others on a very limited set of criteria, and then blames you for your failings. The brutality of this individualism, combined with the shallow narrowness of the value system, leaves individuals stripped of a sense of self-worth and self-efficacy. Quote, "The privatization of stress is a perfectly captured system, elegant in its brutal efficiency. The society and political causation of distress is neatly sidestepped at the same time as discontent is individualized and interiorized." Branding of the self. Trying to become famous isn't a new phenomenon, but the ubiquity of it, and as a YouTuber, I get the irony of me saying this. Significant numbers of people, especially among the young, develop and carefully cultivate an online presence with the primary objective of becoming a commodity themselves. They quite carefully try and construct an image of themselves that is only partially real and only presents themselves as they want to be shown. It is a parody of an intimate relationship, as it is designed to keep their followers at a distance by giving them only a curation of personality. I need to turn back again to our friend Jimmy Woo and his devastating article, "Capitalism is Dangerous for Your Mental Health." He writes, quote, "Most of us intuitively understand this game and its stakes, which is why we set out very methodically to climb the corporate ladder and to keep our resumes in top shape. This careerist mentality also seeps into our social interactions as we are constantly spiffing up our Facebooks, uploading perfectly saturated Instagrams, and flouting our wokeness in Twitter arguments, all to market ourselves and develop our personal and social brand. These are not the actions of a human being in their natural state, but rather a creature modeling itself after the capitalist firm, an institution bestowed with a legal mandate to relentlessly maximize profits. Social, ethical, and environmental consequences be damned. The corporation checks off so many traits usually associated for psychopathy, manipulativeness, shallow affect, lack of long-term goals, aversion to responsibility, that legal scholar Joel Bakan called it in his book, The Corporation, a pathological institution. If we've ever encountered a person who sought only to pursue self-interest, they would be regarded as a psychopath. Yet increasingly, this is precisely what we are doing and becoming. Close quote. Of course, why would we expect people to behave any differently? How many hours of media do we consume, and what are the messages that we absorb? To bastardize McLuhan, the marketing is the message. We've been brought up in a fundamentalist sales culture. Sales is central to politics, to entertainment, religion, business, academia, health, and yes, even in environmentalism. It often seems like every moment of every day someone is trying to sell you something, an idea, a product, a person, but each is reduced to its benefits for the purchaser and promoted through a sales pitch. When we begin to apply it to ourselves universally, 24 hours a day, it can't help but erode our humanity and leave us unbalanced. Worsening income distribution and poverty traps. We've seen a dramatic increase in income disparities, and people in poverty feel increasingly trapped in their disadvantage. Things like increasing cost of home ownership, reduction in employment benefits, and predatory lending, amongst others, makes poverty much more difficult to escape from. As the Royal College of Psychiatrists report noted, quote, "Inequality is a major determinant of mental illness. The greater the level of inequality, the worse the health outcomes. Children from the poorest households have a threefold greater risk of mental ill health than children from the richest households. Mental illness is consistently associated with deprivation, low income, unemployment, poor education, poor physical health, and increased health risk behavior." Close quote. Inequality, the natural result of unfettered capitalism, makes us mentally sick as a necessary byproduct of the system. What is perhaps worse is that we know that parents with mental health issues tend to raise children with mental health issues. Having a mental illness is a disability that makes work and wealth accumulation more difficult. So you end up in a perfect system of misery. Our system makes us sick and excludes us once we are sick. We pass on our sickness to our children, and they are excluded in turn. Poverty becomes absolutely entrenched among some communities, and the entire promise of social mobility turns out to be a horrifying lie. Commodification of mental health services. The fact that mental health services are not accessible is well documented. Poverty, education, prejudice, lack of government support, lack of employer support, and on and on. Simply, if mental health treatment were always effective, it isn't always available for many people. Even if it is available, sometimes mental health treatment itself reinforces rather than treats the damage done by a materialistic capitalist society. Let's imagine that the system, in its barbarity, causes you to overwork, burn out, and develop a depression disorder. Well, don't fear, pharmaceutical companies are there, and they're ready to sell you drugs to help. These drugs do help. They reduce the symptoms, allowing you to re-engage fully in a system that made you ill in the first place, producing more symptoms and requiring more drugs. You work to create profit for your employer, you buy drugs and create profits for drug companies, and then you go back to work to make more profit for your employer. Everybody wins. Yay, capitalism! In an article entitled "Does Psychotherapy Reproduce or Disrupt Neoliberal Capitalism?" the authors write, quote, The neoliberal idea of the free-choosing self can be used to obscure and rationalize social inequalities and coercive interventions. From a neoliberalist perspective, social problems and inequalities derive from deficits in individuals, e.g., some people are better than others at making good choices and taking advantage of opportunities, rather than from other possible sources, such as unjust and oppressive sociopolitical structures. Close quote. The impact of neoliberal policies influence psychotherapy approaches and evidence-based practice guidelines when therapists, perhaps inadvertently, are complicit with these agendas and locate problems in individuals rather than in systems. This isn't a generalized criticism. Not all mental health practitioners act blind to the system, but inevitably the biases of our society creep in. Too often, the mental health treatment focuses on changing individuals to fit the system, even if the system is the problem. When advocating for resources, too often doctors will actually use arguments that frighteningly echo neoliberalist ideas and suggest that treatment should actually serve the system that is making people ill. For instance, mental health support makes for happier, more stable, and more productive workers. It is an investment in a healthier economy. Essentially, if we reduce treatment to serving the interests of capitalism, then our main concern is not the health of people, but the health of an impersonal, uncaring system. People are downgraded to a resource, just like farm animals. Pulling it all together. At this point, I'm going to turn back to my own story. Sure, I believe that I am predisposed to anxiety and excessively sensitive or reactive to my environment, but parallel to these proclivities is a set of personal mental processes, thoughts, that reinforce and promote my dis-ease. I have always, from my earliest memories, focused an intense, critical gaze inward. I relentlessly police myself against mistakes. I am constantly ready to criticize and counsel myself whenever I make any type of error. I do this fundamentally because I don't trust myself to successfully navigate this world and, more importantly, have people love me. I'm hard on myself because I want to earn love. These beliefs are inherent to the Protestant values I was raised in. This ethic is steeped in individualism, individual responsibility, tightly linking work, self-denial, and wealth together as a way of demonstrating yourself to be a person worthy of love. Of course, I was constantly policing myself. The values I was raised in emphasized that good people were successful people, and success was achieved through suffering, especially denying oneself pleasures and leisure. Moreover, humans are born sinful, and that is proven by the desire to be lazy. This sinfulness can only be overcome through intense work and suffering. Ethic I was raised in valued stoicism in the face of suffering. It valued rigid control of emotion and minimal expression of emotion. Rather, the individual was responsible to police themselves, remain in control, and keep emotions at bay, avoiding any risk of disrupting the lives of others. To be clear, I've made the values I grew up with explicit. Of course, they weren't taught to me this way, rather through behavior, attitudes, and assumptions. I experienced my childhood as frightening, as cold, as uncompromising, and my emotional disturbances seemed to me to be a uniquely personal failure to implement the values I was taught. I didn't look around at my family and see them mirroring the same discomfort I was, so I figured I must be in the wrong. Perfect internalization. These are more than just the values I was raised with. Max Weber pointed out way back in 1904 that these ethics were absolutely critical to the emergence of capitalism. To illustrate this point, Weber quoted from the ethical writings of Benjamin Franklin. Quote, "Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad, or sits idle 1/2 of the day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense. He has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides. Remember that money is the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and his offspring can beget more, and so on. 5 shillings turned is 6, turned again is 7, and 3 pence, and so on, till it becomes 100 pounds. The more there is of it, the more it produces every turning, so that the profits rise quicker and quicker. He that kills a breeding cow destroys all her offspring to the 1,000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds." Close quote. It is the modification of greed from a sin into wealth accumulation as a moral value that most exemplifies capitalism. So, as I emerged, unintentionally damaged from the cocoon of my family, I found myself embedded in a system that reinforced my beliefs with absolute pathological brutality. Want to be a successful person? Education is important. Don't enjoy your youth. Defer your pleasures until you are established. Recently married and starting a family? Don't prioritize them too much. You've got a career to build and you can wait for retirement. Get a bad performance appraisal at work? The feedback is how you need to change to do better. Fit in, work harder, sacrifice more, earn wealth, grow it, buy things, and prove to people around you your intrinsic worth. If you work long enough, hard enough, and are successful enough, then you can have your retirement to finally relax, assuming you haven't died from suicide or heart disease before then. Everywhere I turned, I was told that self-control was the key to being successful and lovable. That inherently I can only be successful through self-denial, especially through denying my emotions, repressing how I feel. Get treated badly by a boss? Don't express it. Find your work team annoying? Maybe slightly abusive? Shove that frustration down. You need to fit in. You need to build your relationships because it will be the key to promotions. I got really good at it. It worked. I had a great career for many years, but it came at a cost. It came at the cost of my self-esteem. It came at the cost of anxiety and accompanying exhaustion. It came at the cost of needing to self-medicate through alcohol, cigarettes, sex, and coffee to escape, to get a break from the constant self-criticism. Most unpleasantly, at least for me, it came at the cost of having an identity. You cannot have an identity and not know how you feel. Your emotions are the only guidance you have to discovering yourself. They are the only lenses through which you can truly experience the world. Without them, you become a leaf blowing in the wind, ultimately unanchored and at the mercy of your situation. You become a perpetual actor, always adopting the character that you think people expect. Yes, to find recovery, I do need to take personal responsibility and put in an effort. But the expression and the severity of the disorders I suffered from were fully encouraged by the society I lived in. I may not have been healthy if I lived in a healthy society, but I most definitely was sicker and suffering because I lived in an unhealthy capitalist one. In an article on the British Psychological Society website, Oliver James points out significant differences across countries in incidence of mental illness. He analyzed WHO data and concludes that the more selfishly capitalist a country, the worse the mental illness problem becomes. Selfish capitalism is defined as a tendency to privatization, minimum regulations, and materialism. The more SC countries tend to be English-speaking developed nations, the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, while the less selfishly capitalist developed nations are better represented in mainland Europe and Japan. The data shows that SC countries have a much higher prevalence of mental illness than less selfish countries, approximately double. Now that I think I've proven my point, I will conclude by sharing one of the most damning indictments of capitalism I've read. Rod Tweedy writes in the magazine Red Pepper that, quote, "Capitalism is in many respects a mental illness generating system," close quote. He points out how many commenters have drawn the conclusion that capitalism as a way of being and as a way of thinking is pathological and psychopathic. He shares the following story to illustrate. Quote, Robert Hare, one of the world's leading authorities into psychopathy and the originator of the widely accepted Hare checklist used to test for psychopathy, remarked to John Ronson, I shouldn't have done my research just in prisons. I should have spent some time inside the stock exchange as well. But surely stock market psychopaths can't be as bad as serial killer psychopaths, the interviewer asks. Serial killers ruin families, shrugged Bob. Corporate and political psychopaths ruin economies. They ruin societies. Close quote. How could any system that is so cruel that it grinds up good people while also promoting psychopaths and the values of psychopaths ever be remotely healthy? It is time for our society to grow up and stop denying our responsibilities. Responsibilities for the health of our environment, for the health of the people who live in that environment. We need to move past viewing human beings based on an antiquated 17th century conception. We have the research and the data we need to put away our silly and selfish superstitions about humans and capitalism. We know that it is time to begin constructing a system that is more sustainable, that is more healthy, and above all, more human. If you are feeling depressed or anxious, considering hurting yourself, I'm including a list of numbers on the screen right now, all of which will connect you with someone who would like to help. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was one which I enjoyed writing and creating. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please take the time to like and subscribe. Both I and YouTube's algorithm would appreciate it. This is XCG signing off and wishing all of you speed on your journey to freedom.